Why are you doing a dubstep album from 2007? Well, all I've got to say is, listen to this. Burial was anonymous up to and for a good while after the release of this album, and while a lot of people will have known who he was by the time they heard it, I think that there's still a sense of isolation and anonymity that permeates the entire record and makes it such a rewarding listening experience and so interesting given the dubstep scene at the time. Having evolved from a mixture of dub reggae and two-step, hence the name dubstep, the thing was still pretty couched in, dance music, sounding like bass lines and hard-hitting drum beats, all that sort of thing, very much rooted in the concept of the drop. With that being said, maybe it's better to work backwards from where he is now. I haven't bought any of Burial's records for a while, but then I haven't bought any records for a while, to be honest. But the last one I bought was this. It's a Truant/Rough Sleeper, which was a double A-side, and it's kind of a template that he's continued on pretty much every release he's put out since the release of Untrue. These things typically aren't an album, and at this point I'd be surprised if he ever releases another one, just because this format seems to be working. He releases double A-sides, they're one or maybe two songs per side. I think it's normally just one, to be honest. I can't think of any examples to you even now that I've said it. And they're, clocking around the 10 to 12 minute mark. Barely even tracks, more kind of these extended soundscapes, very few drums. And yeah, I could have covered one of those, but I thought I wanted to be interesting with what I was doing, so that's why I'm doing this record, which I would still describe as solidly ambient adjacent. If anything, looking at what he eventually came to make, this album was, even at the time, a progression of dubstep past where it was at that point. The fact that, from my own experience playing house parties around the time, it was impossible to mix this with anything. It stood out on its own in terms of the sonics and the general mood of the whole thing. Yes, it's a part of the sort of first wave of dubstep in terms of the mainstream appeal, but to lump it in with every other record by the likes of Scream or Casper, to me that seems reductive at best. I want to start, as usual, when talking about the music on these albums, with the opener. I'm actually just going to touch on the first track, Untitled, because it's just this kind of muffled voice and lots of background noise, and then just this one ominous pulsing bass tone. A good opener should set the mood, and this sets the mood for the more ambient side of it. And then as we move into Archangel, the first, what I would call proper track, it tells us a lot about the nature of the more danceable cuts that we're going to have on this record. Even this club tune, if you could call it that, sounds like if you were in the club, you're outside in the smoking area, you're pretty much alone, there's these isolated muffled voices all the time, vinyl crackle, which you can't help but feel doesn't sound entirely unlike Rain, and it's all it's all got just this vibe of isolation and not misery as such, but almost a melancholy to it. The fact that this whole record sounds so organic, if I may be a production guy for a second, is because of the software that Burial was using. Normally a digital audio workstation, like Reason that you're seeing now, has these grid lines and they have a snap to grid option. So if you see me move this note around, you'll see that it will always land perfectly on the grid. Burial used software called SoundForge to make this record, which doesn't have that feature. So everything is loosely dropped, and no matter how hard you try on a piece of software, you could never get it to land dead on the beat. In exactly the same way as if you're playing a real instrument, you're never going to be that robotically quantized bang onto the beat every single time. This means that even without the application of these weird sounding voices and muffled sounds, which all in and of themselves have a very human element to them. The fact that everything is unquantized and sort of fades slightly in and out of time in a barely perceptible way still adds much more of a human quality to this record than a lot of dance music has. I thought I'd talk about one of the ambient cuts on this record. It sounds more at home here than any dubstep track could. Even if you take the likes of something like Colourful by Scream, or mostly just stuff by Scream to be honest, which does have a distinctly sinister vibe to it, you wouldn't find them at peace with any of the other tracks here. But then Burial just goes into this little ambient, it's almost an interlude, it's only a couple of minutes long, ambient interlude, and it fits perfectly. You barely notice that there aren't drums in it. You barely notice that there are drums in the other ones. It's all one sort of homogeneous, I hate to say it, but vibe? This track is called In McDonalds, and if you look at some of the other track names, it tells us a lot about the sort of push and pull, ebb and flow, the two conflicting but bizarrely synergetic moods that you encounter as you listen to this album. You know, you've got In McDonald's, which is like as gritty as you can get. It's like there's nothing fancy about that. There can't be anything fancy about that. You know, it's probably a late night trip to some greasy shithole to pick up a piece of what can legally but only just be described as chicken sandwiched between two slices of very dry compressed cake. In a way, it doesn't get more real than that. And this is then offset with the sort of, you know, esoterica of something like etched headplate. It's got this fragile vibe to it, which also permeates every single bit of sound on the album. The final track that I want to touch on, and I'm sorry for just talking about the tracks here, but Burial's really an artist that you listen to by yourself. You don't listen to him with friends, you don't listen to him at a club night, you don't really have any experience apart from your own with him, which is why I don't have any stories to link it to this one. But the final track I wanted to touch on is UK, and it's the perfect thing to show someone if they think that this is a dance record. UK's got these rave synths going on in it, and yeah, they're exactly what you'd expect on a dance record, but they're so muddied in filters and reverb and tape distortion and white noise that they barely even register as the same sound that you would hear from, you know, a late 90s trance record that's clearly inspired them. Ultimately, as I say, sometimes I think these albums are things that you should, you know, listen to with people, or you should play out, but the best way to experience Burial is probably on a night bus, out for a walk at night, or just in your room at home. Make sure no one else is in the house so you feel nice and isolated. Stick some headphones on and